India spent 3 years rerouting its oil supply away from the Strait of Hormuz. By 2026, Parliament was told 70% of crude no longer passed through the strait. Then, the same week the blockade began, Washington canceled India's license to buy discounted Russian oil. India burns 4.8 million barrels every day. Its emergency reserve holds just 5 days of supply. Here is what does not add up. India engineered 2 escape routes from Hormuz. The moment Hormuz closed, both closed with it. By the end of this video, you will understand how and what it means for your fuel bill, food prices, and India's economy. To really grasp the stakes here, you have to understand the sheer scale of India's energy appetite. We are talking about a $147 billion annual oil bill. And that number, it dictates the price of literally every liter of petrol at the pump, every single kilogram of urea sitting on a farmer's field, and every flight ticket you book going into the festive season. When crude moves, India moves right along with it. And lately, crude moved 50% in just 8 weeks, jumping from $80 all the way to $122 a barrel. This is Voice on Pages. The story comes down to 3 things: the exposure India thought it had fixed, the double lock that snapped shut simultaneously, and the clock that is already counting down. Let's dive into that first part, the exposure India genuinely believed it had solved. If you take a look at this breakdown of India's crude import mix, you'll see Iraq sits right there, supplying 20.5%. That is nearly 1 million barrels every single day. But here is the absolute kicker. Every single drop of that Iraqi crude exits through Basra on the Persian Gulf, which means every barrel has to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. There is literally no alternative route. The best way to think about India's oil supply is like a house with 2 front doors. Sure, over the years, India added a back door by rerouting ships around the Cape of Good Hope and diversifying its suppliers. But they never actually replaced those main front doors. They just kind of stopped using them as often, assuming they'd always open when needed. And guys, this vulnerability isn't just theoretical anymore. Back in April 2026, the Sanmar Herald, which is an Indian supertanker carrying 1.5 million barrels of Iraqi crude, was actually fired upon by Iranian forces. The ship had to turn back. Those barrels, they never arrived. And if you think it's just about crude oil, remember that India imports 60% of its LPG, and a staggering 90% of that transits right through Hormuz. We're talking about 300 million Indian households relying entirely on one tiny geographical choke point. Let that sink in for a second. All right, so that brings us to the double lock. India suddenly found itself trapped in this impossible paradox, where the Gulf route was physically blocked by conflict, and simultaneously, the alternative Russian route became legally blocked. It is exactly like being locked out of your house. You remember a spare key hidden at the neighbor's place, the exact one you've been quietly relying on for 3 years. You walk over to get it, only to find out the key expired last week. They're just not handing it out anymore. That is exactly what happened when India's Russian oil waiver expired in mid-April 2026, and Washington flat out refused to renew it. Knowing this legal window was slamming shut, Indian refiners deliberately went on a massive buying bench, grabbing 30 to 60 million barrels of Russian crude in March 2026. But the problem is that stockpile is draining incredibly fast, and it's happening while Brent crude sits at a brutal $122, up from $80 when this whole crisis kicked off. Remember, Russia supplied 36.3% of India's crude back in 2024. Now, that route is legally locked just as the Gulf is physically shut. And get this, that brings us to the clock. India's Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or SPR, is basically like a fire extinguisher in a building. It's designed to buy you a little time, not to fight the entire raging fire. Right now, India's extinguisher holds just 5 days of spray, sitting at 64% capacity. To put that into perspective, the International Energy Agency recommends a minimum of 90 days. So without Hormuz, these massive tankers are forced to reroute all the way around the Cape of Good Hope. This isn't just a minor detour. It adds 10 to 16 extra sailing days and tacks on roughly $1 million in additional costs for every single tanker voyage. The logistics are an absolute nightmare. The financial toll of all this is just astronomical. Every time crude rises by $10 a barrel, India's current account deficit widens by $12 to $15 billion. Brent crude just rose $42. That is essentially 4 simultaneous $10 shocks slamming into the economy at the exact same time. So what does this actually mean for you? Well, let's look at the specific sectors. First up, fertilizer. India imports 71 to 75% of its urea straight from the Gulf. On top of that, the LNG needed for domestic urea production, 90% of it comes through Hormuz, right as the crucial Kharif planting season is just weeks away. Second, aviation. Jet fuel makes up 30 to 55% of airline operating costs. And guess what? Those ticket surcharges are already live. Finally, manufacturing. Industries relying on petrochemicals, plastics, and tires are facing massive supply delays because that Cape rerouting adds an extra 3 weeks to their lead times. The cascade effect bleeding into your daily life is severe. Historically, every $10 rise in oil adds 0.35 to 0.60 percentage points to India's headline inflation. Crude rose $42. Do the math. But here is what most coverage is missing. The U.S. deliberately blockaded Hormuz to apply pressure on Iran. But the biggest beneficiary of this chaos is quietly Russia. And the biggest payer? India, a U.S. strategic partner that had absolutely nothing to do with starting this war. And here is the real twist. Within days of this escalation, Russia immediately stepped in and offered 9.5 million barrels to India. That is enough to cover 40% of the country's entire crude requirement. The U.S. leaving the Gulf created a vacuum. This is what it costs India. To really grasp the gravity of this clock ticking down, we have to look back at history. During the 1973 oil embargo, India's import bill literally tripled in a single year. Oil ended up consuming 40% of all export earnings. The country's GDP crashed to just 1%, and inflation spiked well over 20%. But here is the truly terrifying reality of our current situation. Back in 1973, India actually had more of a buffer. Today, the SPR sits at just 5 days. Right now, we are staring down 3 possible scenarios. 1. A short blockade lasting 4 to 6 weeks. It would be painful, but ultimately survivable. 2. A medium-term crisis of 3 to 6 months. This is where the SPR gets completely exhausted and we start seeing real physical fuel shortages. 3. A long-term disruption. If this happens, India's entire energy architecture needs a ground-up rebuilding, and it would make the 1973 crash look like a warm-up. America winning the oil war but losing the energy war, India is caught in that gap. India spent 3 years rerouting its oil supply. It was not enough. Does this crisis finally force India to build the 90-day reserve the International Energy Agency has recommended for a decade? Or does India wait for the next one? Drop your prediction in the comments.